Hey, here's Ezekiel here, and today's walking tour is at Nottingham Castle, built in 1068. And then in 1154, Henry II fortified the castle with stone walls and new buildings. Over a period of time, the castle declined, thus needing restoration. So in 1679, the castle became a Renaissance palace, and now the palace is run by the city council. The gatehouse we see today was constructed in 1250 to 1255, which survives up to the first floor, with its two towers, drawbridge and portcullis. The outer gate is typical of its time, but although Henry had many built, it is only one of three to survive. Its upper floors would have provided accommodation for a gatekeeper and porter, as well as housing the mechanism for raising and lowering the drawbridge and portcullis. However, its walls are relatively thin, and it is not strongly defended. Perhaps the builders skimped on the gatehouse. The same might apply to the new curtain wall that had to be repaired by Henry's son, Edward I. This memorial in the Outer Bailey is for Albert Ball from 1896 to 1917. Born at Lenton, was the Allies' most successful fighter pilot of World War I. Killed at age 20 when his SC-5 biplane crashed in France. He was described as the Wonder Boy of the Flying Corps, an ace of the English aces. A month after he was killed, crowds lined the streets before a memorial service at St Mary's Church in the city centre. Nottingham Castle is on a commanding position on a natural promontory known as Castle Rock, which dominates the city skyline, with cliffs 130 feet, 40 metres high to the south and west. For centuries, the castle served as one of the most important in England, for nobles and royalty alike, in a strategic position due to its location near a crossing of the River Trent. Nottingham is a typical example of a Norman castle. All have at least one bailey, an enclosed and defended area, and a motte or mound on which there's a keep. Although the keep was a defensive tower, Norman castles were primarily military offensive structures. Here lies the body of a Sherwood nobleman. Though we know not his name or face, we mark his resting in this place. The Peverils had backed King Stephen in his war against his cousin Matilda for the English throne, Appreciating Nottingham's importance in a struggle to become queen, Matilda's forces tried to capture the castle in 1140. They were unsuccessful but burnt the town down as they retreated. A year later, Peveril was briefly captured at the Battle of Lincoln and his lands confiscated before he successfully retook the castle with an assorted band of soldiers and local millers. However, 12 years later, Matilda's forces returned under the command of her son, the future Henry II, but deciding it futile to attack, they again set fire to the town below. Matilda was William the Conqueror's granddaughter, daughter of his son King Henry I. As she had no surviving brothers, the English and Norman barons swore to accept her as the Norman heir to the throne. However, being female was perceived as a big disadvantage in an age of warrior rules. Furthermore, Matilda was also married to a traditional enemy of Normandy, the Duke of Anjou, and she hadn't even visited England for 20 years. She was also known not to heed the advice of those around her. On her father the king's death, her cousin Stephen seized the throne, but Matilda refused to give up her hereditary claim without a fight. The violent 19-year struggle that ensued had come to known as the Anarchy. After the forces captured Stephen at Lincoln, it was agreed Matilda should at last become queen. But as she waited to be crowned at Westminster, she decided against her advisor's recommendation to tax the citizens of London. Incensed Londoners stormed her lodgings, forcing her to escape. Her coronation cancelled. The conflict continued and was only resolved by a treaty of 1153, stating Stephen could remain king for his lifetime. Matilda's son would then succeed him and become Henry II. This is the highest point of the castle rock, home to the most important buildings of the medieval castle. Protected by the 12th century curtain wall, the upper bailey contained a rectangular keep and chapels, gatehouse and residential accommodation, including the earlier royal apartments. It was also the site of the prison and the bakehouse. All of these buildings were destroyed in 1651. The buildings before us were constructed between 1674 and 1679 as a residence for the Duke of Newcastle. When Henry II came to the throne, the Peveril's family tenure of the castle became untenable. However, the new king was to be a regular visitor to the castle, even spending a Christmas there. Nonetheless, in his absence, and that of the new constable, there was in 1174 a further failed attempt to capture it. Once again, this led to the town being set on fire, the third time in 34 years. Throughout the anarchy of the previous reign, The castle had remained a series of timber structures within a timber palisade. It was only in the run-up to the unsuccessful 1174 assault that works began to proof it against new improved siege techniques. The most expensive part was building a stone curtain wall around the upper and middle baileys, but with the further works Henry II transformed Nottingham Castle into a provincial palace, doing away with its hastily built military look and turning it into the sort of medieval castle recognisable to modern eye. Symbolically placed next to the keep in the upper bailey was the King's apartments, newly rebuilt in stone, plus his new private chapel. The Queen's apartments were across the bailey and included chamber, bedchamber, wardrobe and privy, as she too had a private little or white chapel. There were, including the main chapel in the middle bailey, at least 3 places of worship on site, giving an insight into the extent of daily religious observance at medieval times. The Great Hall once stood before us, a focal point of formal castle life. It was a place of feasting and celebration. When the monarch was in residence, it was also used for receiving dignitaries and may have been used for the numerous parliaments held in Nottingham and for councils of war. Built for King Henry II, the hall would have contained a low platform for the monarch at one end, and long wooden benches and tables for those attending. Here you can see the remains of the northeast tower, built for King Henry III. It was part of an extensive building and refurbishment programme that started in 1237. The surviving chamber was originally at basement level. Evidence suggests that it may have been a basement prison cell for a time, entered via a trapdoor from the wooden floor above. Major Jonathan White, 1804 to 1889. Jonathan John T. White, born at Radford in 1804. After what he describes as a mere bread and cheese education, he worked for his father, a butcher, in the shambles until he joined the army at the age of 16. After 18 years' service in India and taking part in the first Afghan wars of 1838 to 1839, he returned to civilian life in Nottingham, but he was soon asked to drill the part-time volunteer soldiers of the newly formed Robin Hood Rifles and came to be described as the father of the regiment. An obelisk commemorating members of the local raised 59th Regiment of Foot who died in the Afghan campaign of 1878 to 1880. It was erected by surviving colleagues. Today the inner ditch is partly covered by the gallery's extension. Originally it sat between the middle and upper baileys, forming a key part of the castle defences. From the ditch you could access storerooms and passageways carved into the stone, which are still in existence today. In the 14th century, the ditch was partially filled in to provide a location for a new bakehouse and storerooms. The castle's most famous cave is of course the Mortimer's Hole Tunnel, named or misnamed after the kidnap of Roger Mortimer, who was spirited from the castle by the future Edward III and his men. Over its length it falls 126 feet, 38 metres from the southeast corner of the upper bailey to the foot of the rock. This tunnel's construction may have been ordered by Richard I as a way to sneak out from the castle to attack besieging forces. It would have been more practical, however, for Mortimer's captors to use the now sealed passage leading from the northwest to the Middle Bailey. Its name suggests it was at some time confused with King David's dungeon. Scottish King David II is said highly improbable to have been imprisoned there for 11 years after his capture at the Battle of Neville Cross in 1346. In October 1322, Roger Mortimer and Queen Isabella were staying at the castle while Edward and his queen lodged in the town. The castle's constable having agreed to leave a gate unlocked. One night, Edward and his supporters approached along a 115-yard, 105 metres old tunnel cut into the rock, leading from the brewhouse yard to the castle's upper bailey. Surprising Mortimer in his tower, the raiders killed his guards and were able to tie him up before he could arm himself. Then, having captured the queen as she sat at the council, they led their captors from the castle. Mortimer was later hanged in London, while Queen Isabella went into a luxurious exile at Castle Rising in Norfolk, during which she had said to enjoyed regular contact with her grandchildren. Nottingham was the first city in Britain to develop air raid precautions (ARP), and even before war was declared, there were discussions about the cave's suitability for use as air raid shelters. In fact, an archaeologist who had supported the theory that the caves were created by an ancient underground civilization now produced plans for their dramatic expansion to shelter Nottingham's entire population of 250,000 from Nazi bombing. His scheme proposed the creation of over 40 miles of passages and was described as providing every convenience in the way of bathrooms, canteens and electric lighting for those taking refuge. To make the work affordable, he advocated using local volunteer labour. The corporation, however, decided against the construction, although they did use his plans for smaller shelters beneath the castle. There was an ARP headquarters with office space and sleeping area at Brewhouse Yard in the Cosmic Ray Cave, cosmically so called after its use as a laboratory by the University of Nottingham's chemistry department, and a ducal wine cellar was enlarged for use as a shelter to an extent that enabled its reuse post-war as a 25-yard small-bore firing range. By early 1941, the city had 86 public air raid shelters. This figure included an enormous one with space for 9,000 people, dug beneath the John Player's cigarette factory. Thankfully, the vast shelter proposed for everyone in Nottingham wouldn't have been needed, as the city was not as severely bombed as many others. Its worst nights, referred to as Nottingham Blitz, was the 8th and 9th of May 1941, when more than 100 bombs were dropped, killing 159 and injuring 274. The Reverend Neville Talbot, vicar of St Mary's Church in High Pavements, wrote afterwards, "We had a visitation, nothing compared with some places, but still a real taste. I found a fire going in the south transept of the church. It took a long time to really put it out." Hunting was the main pastime of medieval kings and noblemen. Henry II was described as having an addiction to hunting. The castle's deer park was probably created during his time, and covered around 130 acres, beyond the middle and outer baileys. The park had an acre of fish ponds and a rabbit warren. Both were popular foods for the wealthy. The king also had a falcon rebuilt, and significantly, the bones of a peregrine falcon and 3 sparrowhawks were found when the Middle Bailey's cesspit was excavated. Although the park's trees were felled in the Civil War, the deer remained until 1720, when the land ceased to be an enclosed park and was then gradually built on throughout the 1800s. A life of hunting and religious observance might have been seen as a counterfoil to the castle's history of violent conflict, a history that continued during the reign of Henry II's son, the famous Richard I or Lionheart. Richard was in England for less than 6 months of his 10-year reign and spent a mere £70 on Nottingham Castle. In fact, he undertook little work to any castles. Richard granted his younger brother, the future King John, lands across England including Nottinghamshire, but specifically excluding Nottingham Castle. In 1190, Richard set off on the Third Crusade, leaving John in charge of the country. John, knowing his brother would be away for a long time and may even die on the crusade, took the chance to seize Nottingham Castle for its strategic importance. Richard returned to England and on the 25th of March 1194 arrived at the foot of the castle. With such a vast multitude of men and such a clamour of trumpets and clarions that those who were in the castle, on hearing and on seeing this, were astonished and were confounded and alarmed. He commenced the assault to retake the castle by storming it and threatening bombardment with a trebuchet, a great stone-throwing catapult, and igniting, possibly with flaming arrows, his new terror weapon of Greek fire he'd probably learnt about during his crusade. In the ensuing battle, the captured defenders were hanged in view of their comrades still holding out. Three days later, following the mediation of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the remaining defenders did surrender and were ransomed. Records reveal payments for their lives continued to be made for several years. Upon Richard's death 5 years later, John became king. Nottingham Castle was to be a favoured residence, and he kept a treasury there, which to finance the governing of the north of England. The castle's accounts reveal some interesting domestic expenditure, including various hunting expenses, and 9 shillings to William the water-bearer for filling 2 baths, the latter charge raising the question of the frequency of royal bathing. As John is believed to have invented the dressing gown, might it be assumed he bathed often? Such homely expenses shouldn't believe the financing of a great arsenal, and even the construction there of 2 rock-throwing engines by Masters Randolphus and Nicholas for John's siege train. John also invested in the castle structure by building a stone tower in the upper bailey and a barbican to help defend the outer gate. All this spending is indicative of the importance he attached to the castle's role in securing the Midlands. The area at the base of the south side of the castle wasn't always used for brewing. In medieval times there were 5 mills for grinding corn and a house for a miller. Milling, as well as the letting of mills, was a good source of income for the castle. However, milling is thought to have ceased by 1565, as there's a record of 40 cartloads of stone, probably from the demolished mill buildings, being taken away and used to repair the Trent Bridge. The ye old trip to Jerusalem is said to be the oldest inn in England and dates back to 1189, built into the rocks underneath Nottingham Castle, and was originally the castle's brewhouse. The name derives from King Richard the Lionheart and his men gathering there before journeying to Jerusalem in 1189. It is also said to be a hideout for the legendary outlaw Robin Hood. Although John is an important person in the castle's history, he's more famous for other things, such as his wanton cruelty, his frequently starved opponents to death in the captivity, financially exploiting the country, and Magna Carta, the Great Charter, which was agreed at Runnymede on the 15th of June 1215. Magna Carta established that everyone, even the monarch, is subject to the law and has the right to a fair trial. It is consequently one of the most important documents in history. One of the 4 surviving copies can be found in Lincoln. John's refusal to abide by its terms led to a civil war. It was during this that his treasures were lost in the salt marshes of the Wash, and he died shortly afterwards at Newark Castle, 20 miles east of Nottingham, during 18th or 19th of October 1216. His cause of death has been subject of much speculation and includes a surfeit of unripe peaches, too much sweet ale, or even poison from a toad. Most likely, however, it was dysentery. This rock has stood here for more than 400,000 years. It is made of a gritty, pebbly rock called Nottingham Sandstone. Unlike most sandstone, it is soft and crumbly and easy to dig out to make caves and tunnels, such as those in Castle Rock itself. In the past, Nottingham's caves have been used as stables, tanneries, places to store beer, and even homes. Nottingham has more caves than any city in Britain, all of which are man-made. John's oldest son, Henry III, was only a boy when his father died at Newark. He grew up to be an architectural connoisseur and built prolifically across his kingdom, including rebuilding Edward the Confessor's Westminster Abbey. Here at Nottingham, he spent nearly £3,000, leaving a contemporary chronicle to describe it as a peerless in the realm. His instructions were as detailed as an architect's specification regarding materials and decoration. He would impatiently await results while the sheriff in charge struggled to cope. Even while on military campaign in France, he sent an order that Nottingham Castle's new tower windows must face the Trent Valley, not farmland. Such a consideration, no doubt, had a defensive motive, as well as an aesthetic one, but it is still noteworthy how much thought Henry gave to convenience and comfort at the castle, especially following his marriage in 1236 to Eleanor of Provence and their several stays here as a couple. Buildings began to link by covered walkways, and windows were glazed rather than simply shuttered. The King's chamber was panelled, and the Queen's chamber, wardrobe and chapel were all whitewashed. They were probably also painted with red lines to simulate blockwork and given a central floral motif. Although Edward I, from 1272 to 1307, stayed several times at Nottingham, he only spent money on repairs and the building of a 2-mile wall around the town. It was in Wales that he famously built castles, and at Carnarvon Castle that his fourth son, the future Edward II, from 1307 to 1327 was born in 1284. Edward II was to be a more frequent visitor to Nottingham. There were several years of bad weather in Edward II's reign, leading to a poor harvest. This, plus precautions in case of future siege perhaps, were possibly behind construction of another enclosure or peel on the west side of the castle, which could have been used to pen livestock. Efforts were also made to keep the Trent fully navigable, so the castle could keep the well supplied. But hunger in the town below led to the castle staff being assaulted when they ventured out. A castle's bailey is a compound surrounded by walls. A medieval castle could have several, and by 1200 Nottingham Castle had 3. We are standing in the castle's outer bailey. It was well fortified to protect the castle's inhabitants. It was here that archery may have been practised. In 1252, all Englishmen aged between 15 and 60 years were required by law to have a bow and arrow. Originally, the outer bailey extended northwards, beyond the current curtain wall, containing wooden buildings, although no evidence of these survive. Although Edward II fathered children, research indicates his possible homosexuality, something then furiously condemned by the Church. It was certainly his close relationships, whether sexual or not, with a knight called Piers Gaveston, who was Constable of Nottingham Castle, and later with Hugh Despenser the Younger, that led to accusations of favouritism and contributed to his political difficulties. 3 years before Edward's death at Berkeley Castle, there had even been an attempt to kill him and Hugh Despenser using black magic. A magician called John of Nottingham was commissioned to create wax effigies into which pins were to be stuck. The plot was interrupted, but only after a trial. Victim is said to have been successfully killed. On the outbreak of civil war in 1322, Edward's supporters, led by Sir William Montagu, were initially successful, and the castle was used to incarcerate his captured opponents. But disaster befell when he was captured himself by an invading force, led by his own wife Isabella, known as the She Wold of France, and her lover, the powerful Welsh Marches Baron, Roger Mortimer. Edward was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire and famously murdered there, allegedly with a red-hot poker in his anus. Near this site, King Charles I raised his royal standard on August the 22nd, 1642, an act which marked the beginning of the English Civil War, presented by the Sealed Knot Society on the 350th anniversary. In front of us is a ruined section of the Middle Bailey Wall. A bailey is an enclosed area within a castle. Nottingham Castle has 3 baileys, an outer, middle and upper bailey, all of which in medieval times would have been strongly defended. This wall would originally have been a wooden palisade, a wall made of sharpened stakes, as part of the first Norman castle, built in 1068. Between 1171 and 1189, over £1,800 was spent on the castle, including enclosing the middle and upper baileys in stone walls. That was completed in 1173, and then further heightened in 1187 during the reign of Henry II. To the right would have been the northeast tower, built around 1251 in the reign of Henry III. This would have been a formidable fortification should attackers get past the outer Bailey Gatehouse. The 13th century chronicler Thomas Wykes describes Nottingham Castle defences as peerless in the realms. To the left at the top of the road is what we know as Richard's Tower, named after Richard III, though it was actually built by his brother, Edward IV, between 1476 and 1480. Thank you all for watching. If you did enjoy our video, please consider subscribing. hit the notification bell, give us a thumbs up and maybe leave us a comment. Do take care and have a fantastic week ahead.